Even as families began burying their dead, investigators today assembled a checklist of possible causes in Friday's crash of Pan American Flight 759. 153 people were killed in the New Orleans crash, the second highest toll in U.S. aviation history. And now, as Bruce Hall reports, there is word the crew knew its fate long moments before the end.
Federal officials investigating the crash of Flight 759 say the flight never gained enough altitude to clear the trees a quarter mile off the end of the runway, and at no time was it more than 100 feet off the ground. Investigators have now begun to concentrate on three causes of the crash. First, wind shear, an abrupt change in the wind that can force the plane's engines to stall. Second, heavy rain ingested into the engines in conjunction with a wind shear. And third, a possible mechanical malfunction aboard the plane. Investigators are also piecing together evidence about ground instructions to the pilots concerning weather and takeoff conditions. They say at 3:54 Friday, the pilots were given taxiing instructions. At 4:02, ground control issued a wind shear alert as detection devices set off an alarm in the control tower. A minute later, a more serious weather warning. Quote, wind 17 knots, gusting to 23. Low-level wind shear alert, all quadrants. Frontal passage right now. We are in the middle of everything, unquote. Then 3 minutes later, the control tower cleared Flight 759 for takeoff. However, it is not known if the Pan Am pilots actually heard the warnings from ground control or had already switched their radios to the control tower frequency. Witnesses said that despite heavy rain, the takeoff appeared normal. However, by the time the plane crossed the end of the runway, its tail dropped sharply, clipping the tops of the first trees. It crashed 4 blocks later. Investigators will spend the next 4 to 6 months working on their final report, but they are zeroing in on wind shear as the cause of the accident. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Kenner, Louisiana.
We've got 2,000 foot per minute downdrafts. We've got a lot of blowing dust on the ground. See what you can do to talk them out of landing aircraft through here.
There is danger, but it cannot be seen with the naked eye. It must be probed with sensors and computers. Readouts that tell scientists on this research plane where they can find and challenge one of nature's almost invisible killers. In this Colorado wheat field, special new radar helps in the hunt. So sophisticated, it can spot a bee at 60 miles. So sensitive, it can literally see the wind. And can show scientists on the ground how fast the winds are blowing. Can show an angry red where the winds and clouds have combined to form wind shear, what scientists call microbursts.
We have another microburst reported at
That's when clouds release moisture. That moisture evaporates and cools the surrounding air. The cooler air sinks, creating extreme downdrafts that can suddenly accelerate to 100 miles per hour and just as suddenly be gone. A pilot flying through wind shear would likely see nothing. His plane would be forced down. On takeoffs or landings, his plane could crash onto the ground. It was late June, 11 days before the Pan Am crash. Meteorologist John McCarthy spotted wind shear conditions on radar and dashed outside. A meteorologist or pilot would look at these clouds, he says, and suspect nothing.
Before our kind of work came along, no big deal. We hope to change that consciousness and that awareness that that kind of situation is extremely severe.
How severe?
Enough to blow up an aircraft on landing.
That's what happened that day in June 1975 when Eastern Airlines Flight 66 was landing at Kennedy Airport in New York. Federal investigators determined that wind shear at the beginning of the runway slammed the jet onto the ground, killing 113 people and injuring 12. In the moments before last Friday's Pan Am crash, instruments at New Orleans provided data based mainly on wind gauges spread around the field. Denver scientists suspect a warning system like that could easily miss the kinds of microburst and wind shear conditions now under investigation as possible causes in this crash. Project scientists hope that by next year, they may be able to give regular wind shear advisories to pilots here at Denver's Stapleton Airport. And in years ahead, that sort of information may be available to pilots at all major airports. Barry Peterson, CBS News, near Boulder, Colorado.
The talks to save Beirut are stalled, and a key Lebanese mediator now says it's up to the United States to get them going again. Former Prime Minister Saeed Salam said it's up to the U.S. to find countries willing to accept the PLO guerrillas now that Syria has said it doesn't want them. Another ceasefire is holding tonight. Perhaps both sides need to rest after yesterday's furious exchange of fire, during which, for the first time, PLO gunners hit Israeli-controlled East Beirut. But the toll in West Beirut, Richard Roth tells us, was far greater.
For the second time since the fighting began, Berbere Hospital in West Beirut was one of the buildings hit.
I mean, I've been here for 8 years, and I've never seen the panic that I saw yesterday. Everybody was screaming, running down the stairs. The nurses couldn't work anymore. They panicked.
Flying debris injured 6 people here. Other hospitals were hard-pressed to handle the dead and wounded.
The nature of the injuries, shrapnels.
In all, according to police, the long artillery and rocket barrage killed 75 people, wounded 180. George Habash of the Militant Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine today said the punishing attack had changed nothing.
We are ready to go on, go on, go on, go on, go on, till it's no more possible to go on, and this means that we sacrifice ourselves.
Authorities estimated that 10,000 shells fell on West Beirut. Damage was worst on the city's southern outskirts, where several embassies took direct hits. Most diplomats had left these buildings long ago. Palestinian gunners patrol the area constantly, though the PLO denies there are military targets here. A cameraman who tried to photograph one gun position right next to an embassy was waved away. One effect of the repeated shelling has been to concentrate civilian refugees and Palestinian gun positions deep in the city center. So much of Beirut has now been destroyed, there are no longer any distinct borders between civilian areas and military ones. Richard Roth, CBS News, West Beirut.
White House correspondent Leslie Stahl reports that top U.S. officials have acknowledged that President Reagan sent Israeli Prime Minister Begin what is described as a sternly worded letter about Lebanon. The letter supposedly warns that if Israel continues its tight blockade of Beirut, the U.S., and we quote, will have to explore other ways of dealing with PLO negotiators. But the U.S. officials, according to correspondent Stahl, say Mr. Reagan did not intend to suggest that the U.S. would talk directly with the PLO. One source said, and again I quote, "No one in this government wants that." Rescue teams are looking for more survivors in the wreckage of a Mexican express train that derailed yesterday near the city of Tepic. As many as 48 people were killed, and 2 Americans are reported among the injured. The train is called the Bullet, and it runs between Guadalajara and Mexicali, near the California border. Britain said today it is satisfied that Argentina has no intentions of reopening the Falklands War, and that as a result, Britain is returning immediately its last 593 POWs. In Washington, President Reagan said the U.S. is lifting the economic sanctions it imposed on Argentina 2.5 months ago, effective today. It wasn't that long ago that voices were being raised in the House of Commons over the war with Argentina. Today, voices were being raised again over something much closer to home. Buckingham Palace, to be precise. A man managed to slip into the palace and get right into the Queen's own bedroom, where he chatted with the startled monarch. Mark Phillips picks up the story.
The Queen seemed none the worse for her experience as she appeared in public today at St. Paul's Cathedral. But the incident Friday in which a man made his way, apparently unchallenged, into her bedroom at Buckingham Palace has shocked Britain and resulted in a Scotland Yard investigation of royal security. For some time, it's been feared that protection for the royal family at Buckingham Palace and other locations was more ceremonial than effective. There have been 5 relatively minor breaches in the past 13 months. But on Friday morning, a man managed to get through a palace window, it's thought by climbing a drain pipe, and sat chatting with the Queen on her bed for 10 minutes. She finally went for help when he asked for a cigarette. The incident is deeply embarrassing for the Home Secretary, William Whitelaw, who claimed to have tightened security after the earlier incidents.
He told us that security had been recently improved. Since that improvement resulted in a man getting into the Queen's bedroom, how bad was it before the improvement?
All I was saying was that in the last 18 months, substantial physical protection arrangements have been made.
A 30-year-old man, Michael Fagan, is in police custody. He is also thought to have been involved in one of the earlier break-ins. And security has been tightened at the palace with new barbed wire and television cameras installed. But even today there were apparent gaps in the system. A painter's ladder led directly to an open window. Because of the special symbolic role the Queen plays in Britain, security around her has always had to be compromised in order to keep her visible and accessible. In the current environment, though, her visibility and accessibility are likely to be compromised in the interest of protection. Mark Phillips, CBS News, London.
A trade journal says new imported cars took a 30.6 share of the U.S. market in June, a record for the month. Meanwhile, according to Ward's Automotive Reports, inventories of unsold new cars at the 5 major domestic automakers rose to 79 days at the end of June, compared to 52 days a month earlier. President Reagan tomorrow is set to push publicly for a revised version of what he calls his new federalism proposal. But the National League of Cities, representing 15,000 municipalities, already has its answer. We have to say no thank you, and we have to say it harder than the League has ever said it before. That's a direct quote, a comment today from Seattle Mayor Charles Royer, first vice president of the organization. Royer said the League supports the concept of new federalism, but does not believe it can succeed without adequate state and local funding capabilities. And he said a survey of 43 cities indicates, again, quote, expenditures are growing at a faster rate than sources of revenue. When Ronald and Nancy Reagan moved to Washington, they decided to sell their 5-bedroom house in Pacific Palisades. An elderly couple, prospective buyers, came forward. They said their net worth was more than $13 million. Jerry Bowen says the Reagan house was their dream house in more ways than one.
74-year-old Ann Yarborough claims she is jobless. Her 60-year-old husband, James, says he lives on disability payments. But for a time last year, on paper at least, they were the buyers of President Reagan's former Pacific Palisades home. First Lady Nancy Reagan even drained the swimming pool for Mrs. Yarborough's inspection. The $1.4 million deal eventually fell through when the Yarboroughs failed to come up with the $400,000 down payment.
Did they ever have any intentions at all of trying to purchase, of actually purchasing the Reagan house?
I wouldn't have filed a count if I didn't think they didn't.
What the LA District Attorney's Office believes is that the Yarboroughs wanted to use the paperwork from the Reagan deal as the basis for investment scams. Conspiracy and grand theft charges were filed against the couple, and while the Reagans lost no money, Mrs. Reagan may be called as a witness.
I think it's been made into a circus because the president's name is involved.
Neither the Yarboroughs nor their attorney would comment on the case, which involves other real estate frauds allegedly tried by the couple. But Mrs. Yarborough is described by the district attorney's office in published reports as, quote, an old con artist. One of the unanswered questions is how she was able to talk her way into the president's California house. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
House Speaker Tip O'Neill said today that the FBI has told him it has no corroborative evidence to back up charges by a former congressional page. The page had charged that some members of Congress engaged in homosexual activity with some congressional pages. Meanwhile, Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker said there would be an investigation of the Senate page system. Bob Schieffer says some people are asking whether members of Congress need pages at all.
In spite of all the charges being hurled around Capitol Hill, not much has been said yet about two serious questions that must eventually be answered. They are, do congressmen really need a corps of teenagers to wait on them? And if so, why are the teenagers allowed to live in unsupervised conditions no boarding school in the country would tolerate?
It's your first time away from home. You're in a big city. You have a salary between $8,000 and $10,000 a year, and you're totally unsupervised in your off hours.
Congress requires the students to attend classes each morning in the Library of Congress, and when the House and Senate are in session, they run errands under loose supervision of Capitol employees. But off-duty, unless the Congress member who appoints them keeps up with them, they are on their own. Because when they come here, their parents sign a release absolving the government of all responsibility for looking after them. Congressman Paul Simon believes they should be housed in dormitories.
What we need now is clear-cut authority as to who is responsible for the Page School. That is not clear-cut right now. And if we are unwilling to do that, then I think we have to move toward having college-age pages.
Some years back, Congress purchased this choice piece of Washington real estate for more than $1 million to build a dorm, but cost estimates for the dorm building were in excess of $10 million, so the project was never funded. Congresswoman Pat Schroeder of Colorado says it would be cheaper to send the teenagers home, eliminate the program altogether, and hire messengers to run errands. However the questions are answered, the problem should not have caught Congress by surprise. 6 years ago, a House committee, troubled by reports of drug and alcohol use among pages, held hearings. House doorkeeper James Malloy, in charge of the pages, told the panel that unless something was done to supervise the pages in the off-duty hours, that Congress would have a time bomb on its hands. Malloy is still in charge of the program. Congress has done little to change it, but the bomb apparently exploded. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
Arthritis is the name given to more than 100 diseases of the joints. More than 36 million Americans of all ages suffer from the painful, often crippling illness. And now, as David Culhane reports, a promising new painkiller for arthritis is already under attack.
They are victims of arthritis, struggling to take a step. Lift an arm. Do they feel a little bit better after the hospital?
Yeah.
Or simply to make a fist. There is no cure for this disease. Drugs can only relieve the pain. But relief from pain can make the difference between being crippled or leading an almost normal life. Now there is a controversial new pain-killing drug on the market called Oraflex. Some doctors think a number of deaths have been associated with its use. Ben Fishbein has had arthritis for 2 years. It was so bad that he was considering having his hip joint replaced with a plastic device. Then he started taking Oraflex.
Before I started taking the drug, I limped a great deal, and I hardly took a step without having pain. Since taking the medicine, it's been, a tremendous improvement in my life, tremendous help.
Oraflex was introduced 2 months ago, not as a cure, but as a one-a-day medication that offers relief from pain and swelling. It was an instant success. Thousands of people started using it. But almost immediately, the bad news started coming in from Britain, where the drug has been on the market for 2 years. Doctors reported at least 9 deaths, perhaps more, that they said appeared to be associated with the use of the new drug.
Death is not an acceptable side effect for an arthritis drug.
Dr. Eve Bargman represents an American medical consumer group that last month asked the federal government to withdraw Oraflex from the market.
The bottom line is that you have a huge selection of drugs that are all pretty much the same, and we don't see why a single drug that's causing many deaths needs to be available in this country at all.
Eli Lilly and Company, which manufactures Oraflex, argues that the deaths may be due to improper dosage or pre-existing diseases. Lilly also points out that all anti-arthritis drugs, including aspirin, sometimes produce serious side effects.
We are, of course, naturally concerned about those reports, and we are doing everything we can to understand why, for that very small minority of the patients treated, these severe adverse reactions have occurred. We've treated approximately 500,000 patients now outside the United States. So clearly the incidence of this problem, if it is entirely drug-related, is extremely small.
On June 29, the Lilly Company sent out letters to 240,000 American doctors, emphasizing that Oraflex should be given to elderly people in reduced doses. For some arthritis experts, like the chief of the arthritis branch of the National Institutes of Health, that is not enough.
All in all, one has the feeling it looks like it's too much trouble to use. I certainly don't plan to use it, I can tell you that.
Now the Food and Drug Administration says it is monitoring the reports about Oraflex on a daily basis, trying to see what they mean. That leaves people who suffer from arthritis with a dilemma. Which group of doctors should they believe about Oraflex? For some patients, the benefits will outweigh any risk. Other patients will turn to one of the other painkillers.
Good.
Of course, what everyone really needs is a cure for arthritis. But even the most optimistic researchers think that solution is still years away. David Culhane, CBS News, New York.
Secretary of Agriculture John Block is urging President Reagan to lift his ban on negotiating a new grain deal with the Russians. The current agreement expires in September. The president called off negotiations for a new grain deal after martial law was imposed in Poland. Bloch said the Soviets should be allowed to buy as much American grain as they can. The Agriculture Department predicts that this will be the worst wheat harvest in Russia in 7 years because of hot, dry weather there. Against predictions of record American wheat crops, prices seem to be the chief problem facing farmers. Then, as Meredith Vieira reports, the rains came.
It's been slow going. It's been wet everywhere. Texas, we was in mud, and southern Kansas, and then here in Beloit.
It has been a tough year in the wheat belt, and no one knows that better than Glenn Heine. Every summer, he travels from Texas north to the Dakotas, reaping what others have sown. He is a custom cutter, hired by farmers who need help harvesting their wheat. And he's due in South Dakota, but he's still stuck in Kansas, working his way through the mud and listening to hard luck stories.
They can't get enough money for their grain to make their land payments or their rent payments or whatever it is that they make, and still come out on top. They're losing money all the time, is what you hear.
Heine has heard a lot of rain along the way. On some farms like Leon X, it has turned what should have been a tremendous crop into a sea of mush.
You work for it all year, and then this is the way it ends up. That don't make you too happy.
I guess that's where the faith comes in. You just got to believe that the good Lord won't dump any more on us than we can handle.
Dale Consom is relying on the Lord to get him through this year because his custom cutter is still stuck in Oklahoma, and Consom has 1,700 acres of ripe wheat to harvest. He can't cut it fast enough himself. The local grain elevator is full of wheat that wasn't harvested fast enough, poor quality wheat that right now isn't worth to the farmers what it costs to grow. And so it piles up in storage and the farmers wait, hoping that will force up the market price. Glenn Heine can't wait that long, and he can't live off of hard luck stories because when the farmer suffers, so does he. Heine will work through the Kansas night like the other custom cutters, harvesting what he can. And then he'll move on to South Dakota with his old equipment and a pocket full of promises.
If they could kind of maybe scrape through this year, maybe they'd get the price up next year, and it's just kind of been going that way for a long time, you know, but I hope maybe someday it'll come true and we can all make some money.
And that's the CBS Evening News for this Monday. Dan Rather reporting from New York. Thank you for joining us. Good night.